Before we get to today's guest, I just want to let you all know that CityWorks Expo 2017 is coming up October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. We're really excited about the group of speakers we put together for this year, and we've got a number of exciting activities and additional resources we're looking forward to bringing to the table as well. So I hope you'll take a look at our website, cityworksexpo.com, or check us out on Facebook. And just take a look, maybe get yourself a ticket. We'd love to have you guys down to Roanoke. Or check out the fellowship program, which includes a free ticket, but also has access to a number of resources and mentorship opportunities that we're putting together. So thank you all for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoy it today. And please do give us a rating and review in iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. And reach out if you have any questions. Hope to see you come October. But in the meantime, have a great day.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to one of my favorite people in the world and our guest, Miss Vernice Miller-Travis, Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Equitable Development at the Charlottesville-based environmental consulting firm of Skio, and a lifelong environmental justice advocate. How are you doing today, Vernice?
I'm doing fine, Brad. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Last year, having you down here at Expo just about made my year, so it's just a pleasure to talk to you again this afternoon.
Thank you. It was great. It really, really, really was great.
Well, we were so happy to have you, and you've got such a compelling story, having touched on so many different locations and having worked at a very local level, but also having worked at a national level and everywhere in between. So, how do you kind of define what you do and how you came to be doing what you're doing?
What do I do? So, I work with communities that have experienced environmental threats or impairment or harm, or disproportionate environmental impact. I work with those communities to achieve cleanup and restoration and revitalization. And they can be communities that have been marginalized and underinvested for decades. They can be folks that are, sort of newly going through challenges. But I work with folks to really reach a degree of quality of life and standard of living that really every community should be entitled to. And a lot of the communities I work with are low income and or communities of color, tribal communities, communities that really have been bypassed by economic opportunity. And how do we get those folks, into parity and alignment with where, other thriving communities are going. So how do we turn vulnerable?
So it's interesting how the variety of different communities you have to work with, and it's one of the hallmarks of communities these days is that I think we underestimate how much environmental things come into play. That when we think about community environmental issues, we too often think about we want to get the bags out of that stream, or we think about how do we deal with, this is a serious issue now with flooding in coastal communities. But really, what interests me so much about your work is how that intersects with people, which is really not always where we go first when we think about environmental issues.
That is true. And that has been the hallmark of my work for the past almost 31 years, is trying to elevate the concerns of communities into our conversations about environmental restoration, natural resources restoration. I always say, you cannot have healthy places and with unhealthy people. So if you're, looking to restore a landscape, or all the work that's going on here where I live to restore the Chesapeake Bay, for decades, people tried a variety of approaches, spent millions and millions of dollars on everything but restoring communities and making them whole. And I think that it's just impossible to do one without the other. So, and I also think it's impossible to achieve any kind of sustainable objectives, right? whether it's climate resilience or, restoring impaired water bodies, whatever it is that you're working on. If there is inequality and injustice, racial injustice, economic injustice, if there is a population of people who are marginalized, you cannot get to that sustainability or environmental objective if there's injustice and inequality. And so, it's taken a while for that to take hold within the environmental movement and community, but I think we have finally reached that understanding that, you cannot have sustainability with injustice.
I think it's also interesting, too, in that most of the environmental movement these days, they want to talk about big issues. They want to talk about climate change, which is obviously a huge issue, but that's a universal thing in some ways, or chemical pollution. That's very much a universal thing, whereas this is often the effects of those are felt in very specific places, which I think means that the movements can sometimes overlook these individual places where things are happening and real individuals and real communities are bearing the brunt of what is thought of as this big trend actually impacts individuals on the ground every day.
And those big issues, always have localized dimensions, right? You don't just have to look at stratospheric pollution. You can look at the burdens of that pollution in local communities, and not all communities are treated equally, right? Some communities are bearing a disproportionate share of the environmental burden. That makes it possible for others of us to live a good quality of life, but our waste goes somewhere, our garbage goes somewhere, the transportation corridors flow through some places, and they seem to all wind up having a disproportionate impact on the same people in the same places. And, not only is it not fair, but it's just stupid. From a planning standpoint, it's just stupid.
Absolutely. And, I think that often in the past when we think about that, we think about those things go to those places because those communities often have no voice or a lesser voice in some of the decision-making processes. How do you go about ensuring that those voices are amplified and heard where they need to be heard?
Well, first of all, I try to inform folks that people did not make a choice to live in a place where their environment is degraded, where their health is assaulted, where they don't have equal access to the most basic things in life. People did not make that choice. That choice was made for them. In fact, I was just reading an article, and I'm trying to remember where I was reading it, but it was just a great article about the history of, I believe it's the Henry Street community in Roanoke, and the efforts through public policy, right, through federal policy that helped to basically destroy that community and virtually wipe it off the face of the map. But it was a thriving, vibrant community, African-American community with thriving institutions, a thriving economy, lots of homeowners and professionals, et cetera. And urban renewal, virtually destroyed that place. And there's hardly any remnant of that once thriving community in Roanoke anymore, right? So, and that happened all over the country. It was not an accident. And that's what I want people to understand, that we had public policies at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level that often were founded on principles of racial segregation at the housing level, at the economic level, school segregation, and on and on and on and on. And what we're living with in the 21st century are the remnants of those bad planning, land use, public policy decisions that were made in the previous century, but we're still living with them. And it's not an accident. And it's lost on a lot of people who are not old enough to remember or have experienced residential racial segregation. But there were not a lot of places that people of color could live, right? So it's not like, I want to live in this part of town, or I want to live in that part of town. It was clearly defined where Black people, where Latino people, where Native American people could live, where Asian American people could live. And, You could not go outside of the boundaries of that place. Now, that became less and less the case once the 1968 Fair Housing Act was passed. But even then, we just see, I think it was 2015, a case before the United States Supreme Court to allow the Department of Housing and Urban Development to pass and promulgate its policies around inclusive and fair housing. Those policies were mandated with the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And local jurisdictions have fought HUD from implementing that act, which basically said that you cannot bar people, no matter their racial, ethnic, or religious identity. You cannot bar or prevent people from living wherever they want to live, right? A concept that just seems so foundational. Well, of course that's right. It wasn't always the case. The federal government had to promulgate a law and policy to make it so in 1968, and it wasn't until 2015 that the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act, which is what HUD was promulgating these new rules. They tried for decades, and local jurisdictions fought against the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And now we have a HUD secretary who believes that fair housing is social engineering. So even though the Supreme Court has agreed with HUD and fair housing advocates and civil rights advocates that we need to be aggressive about making sure that people have the right to live wherever they choose to live, we are still not there yet. Here we are well into the 21st century and we're still not there yet. So again, people didn't make a choice to live in places where they were not safe, where their families were not safe. It was a firm pattern of policy and practice at every level of government that kept certain people from being able to live in certain places. And we still see that happening today. It's not as in your face as it used to be, so people think it's not a problem anymore, but it is absolutely still a problem.
But that issue you mentioned here in Henry Street is definitely still on the minds. There's been a recent incident where one of the few buildings left from that neighborhood was sold to someone that we don't know who it is, despite community interest in keeping it in essentially community ownership. So it's the forces at play still seem to be devaluing some of the or many of the voices of color in our neighborhoods.
That was the article that I read. It was about holding on to that last piece of history of Henry Street and who now owns it and what its future is going to be. That was the article that I read. If people want to see more about or learn more about this issue, there's a great book that I just recently purchased called The Color of Law: A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. And Richard Rothstein teaches at University of California at Berkeley. But it's still with us. And that's the thing. People keep saying that people of color and poor folks and immigrant communities and indigenous communities, why don't you all just get over it? How long are you going to, talk about the injustices that you suffered? Just, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and move on. But we're still living with the pattern, practice, and policies that kept people segregated, kept people down, kept them from having equal opportunity. We're still living with that today. And in the environmental context, it's very much with us. So people need to understand that. They need to understand that history and not make the assumption that, people live in degraded places because they choose to. They don't choose to. If they could live someplace else, they absolutely would.
But I think that's what's missed in so much of this, particularly from, a lot of the people that are like myself, these, middle-class white folks. We think we move all the time. Why can't these folks that are in these neighborhoods just move to some other place? But that's, it's often not an option, but also no one wants to be forced out of where they are. That community has often already been displaced one time, and so to let either a municipality or for a polluter or whoever, a corporation, to make decisions on the environment that someone lives in, it's a very harmful thing and something that most people don't have any have any voice to get around.
And they also usually don't know that those conversations are being had and that decisions are being made, right? And by the time the average person finds out about it, the decisions have been made, the deals have been done, the funds have been appropriated, and the development is coming, or the redevelopment is coming, and you don't have any choice about it. I remember, so I grew up in New York City in the Harlem community, a once historic African-American community. In fact, one of the most historic African-American communities in the United States. And but now it is no longer a majority people of color community, and that's another conversation for another podcast. But my point is that I moved from New York to Maryland, to the house that I live in now in Bowie, Maryland, in Prince George's County in 1998. And in 2000, I moved back to New York, not permanently, but temporarily to be a program officer at the Ford Foundation. And so there are people from all over the world who come to work at the Ford Foundation. So they have a whole group of people, relocation specialists, who help these folks come and, establish a residence in New York. In my case, I was from New York. I had just been gone for about 2 years. And so I said to the relocation person who was working with me, she asked me, where did I want to live? I said, there's only one community in New York I would ever want to live in, and that's Harlem. She said, okay. She said, what are you looking for? I said, a one-bedroom apartment. Two would be great, but one would be fine. And so she goes and she looks. She finds a lot of leads. She gets back to me, and the average rent that she quoted me was $2,500 in 1998. Now, I had just left, in 2000. I had just left in 1998. My mother and I lived in a duplex apartment in a brownstone for a number of years. We even had a little backyard. Our rent was $1,000 a month, which even then was a little on the high end. But when she quoted $2,500 to me a month, which was at the time more than my mortgage for my 4,000 square foot house, I was just absolutely astonished. And the first thing I thought is, both of my parents were single parents. They split up when I was about 5. And so I lived with my mom for a time. I lived with my dad for a time, but they were both single parents. We lived in home with them. And I just thought, how would any single parent, how would any parent, any working class parent, which my parents were working class, how would they be able to afford to live in Harlem? And that was in 2000. Now, in 2017, it's virtually impossible for working class, poor, low-income people to be able to afford to live in a community that they built with their own hands, that they made, right? So now everybody's all aghast about Harlem. It's not just virtually every historic African-American community in the nation. Every African-American community is facing these pressures of gentrification and displacement. And it's an amazing thing. So I keep threatening to write an article that eventually probably needs to be a book. And the title of it is, Where Are All the Black People Going? Right? Because the Black people are being forced out of the communities that they have held down for some as long as a century, some a few centuries. In the case of Louisiana and Texas and Alabama, where people have lived there since Reconstruction. And now they've been discovered. They call it, the young people call it Columbusing, right? Where you discover something that's already in existence. And they're now the she places. The neighborhood I grew up in Harlem is one of the top real estate markets in New York City. In a million years, Brad, I could never have envisioned such a change happening in the place that I lived. I always knew it was a great community, but it lacked a lot of things. But now it doesn't. Now it's got she bistros and, Italian cafes and restaurants, and a Whole Foods is being built just down the street from the hospital I was born in. It's just extraordinary. And that's happening all over the country. And so, the question that I'm struggling with on a personal level, but also on a professional level, is how do we build communities where people actually live together? We've been talking about this forever, but certainly this was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's main message, building that beloved community where we all could live together, right? I have still not seen that place. I've not seen that place. Even where I live in Maryland, I live in the most affluent African American community in the nation. Highly segregated African American community. Wealthy, upper middle class. The Goddard Space Flight Center is near us, so we got NASA engineers, we got federal employees, we got you name it, and all kinds of black professionals live here where I live. But only black people live here. Now, there's a white part of town, but that is not the part of town that I live in. And it was extraordinary to me to come from New York, which has a history of residential segregation, but to see a fairly new community, like Bowie is an old place, used to be a farming community. But as it has evolved over the decades, it started as a segregated suburban community, a Levittown. And now it's become an affluent, majority African-American community, but still the black people live in South Bowie and the white people live in Old Bowie. I said, this is amazing to me that even in the 21st century, we are still replicating these patterns of residential segregation. What does it take for us as Americans to be able to finally live in integrated communities, integrated at a class level, at an economic level, at an ethnic level, at a racial level? What does it take? Apparently, whatever it is something that we as Americans are incapable of doing.
Well, I think it's perhaps even particularly difficult now because back in the time of, government-sponsored urban renewal, you had a very clear opponent. You had some very clear things that you were going to fight against. Now it seems much more amorphous, that there are these economic trends that are driving things and not just government policies. And so how do you even begin to come to grips with those trends in some ways when there's not a monolithic entity to oppose?
Yeah. Well, I think it requires some soul searching, though, for people at just the most local level, right? So some of this, I think, is just about how we think of and how we conceptualize community, right? What is community? And for the most part, we've defined community as the place where the people who live in the community that I live in look like me, have the same values that I have the same background that I have, and that's what makes a community. But the notion of diversity, right? Diversity defined, writ large, that is what makes a vibrant community. We're not there yet. And the pushback against the notion that we could get there, like this affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, I think the pushback is going to be incredible. Now, there's some communities that are stepping up and really trying to do good, innovative policy making at that level. But, you see across the country, there's an absolute crisis in the need for affordable housing.
Well,
and there just doesn't seem to be a lot of energy about what to do about that, right? Or how to respond to that, or how to create a marketplace that supports the construction of affordable housing as well as market rate housing. And it's a really extraordinary thing. A lot of people are in crisis. A lot of people who live in major metro areas are paying 50, 60% of their income for housing. And they say, the standard should be no more than 30%, right? Mm-hmm. But we see people paying more than half their income, 2/3 of their income, just for housing. So we can't sustain that and be a thriving economy, an informed and educated populace, a dynamic democracy. We can't be any of those things if we can't meet people's most basic needs.
Well, and it's, I think your life's work goes to show that where you live has a big impact on the outcomes that people's lives can go through. That, when you're in a lot of these neighborhoods, there are chemicals that result in developmental disabilities. There are a host of social factors that contribute to limiting potentials for folks. And it's, that's a big part of what you've worked against this whole time, is it not?
It is. That is true. That is absolutely true. And I wonder if we are in a place and in a moment where our national politic is so divisive that the things that we need to be doing, the things that we need to be grappling with to build a more just society, which, we see in Scandinavian countries, that when you have more equity, more social mobility, more social infrastructure that supports communities, that supports individuals, you then have thriving, dynamic economies. Now, Scandinavian countries are also, fairly monolithic in terms of, the ethnic background, but that should not, that should not be the thing that gets in the way of people being able to create policy and structure and guidance and income supports if necessary to make sure that people have what they need. Because, and I think we're at that place, and maybe not a lot of people recognize this, but I think more and more people are recognizing this every day, that when you have massive levels of inequality, whether it's between the wage gap between what women earn and what men earn, or what young people earn and what older people earn, or what people of color are earning versus what white folks are earning, when you have systemic inequality, right, it filters throughout virtually every aspect of a society. And it stops you from being able to be dynamic, from being able to get the most productivity out of your workforce, because a lot of people are forced out of the workforce. And maybe some of your best people are forced out of the workforce. We have a lot of challenges, and we've got to grapple with them, and we've got to tackle them, and we've got to bring our best and our brightest and our most complex thinking to addressing these issues of, long-standing and deepening inequality, because it's stifling our growth as a nation, and it's certainly stifling our democracy.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for mega regions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Do you think that part of the issue is that we no longer have kind of a shared vision or a shared set of values as a society?
Well, I'm wondering if we still have values as a society. I think people, at least for me, being a New Yorker, a native New Yorker, there was a moment in the 1980s, and the Wall Street movie sort of captured it really well, where, the lead character, I think his last name was Gecko in the movie, played by Michael Douglas, says greed is good. I think that notion began to take hold at a fairly fundamental level in our country, and people became very motivated by material acquisition, right? So things will make you happy. The acquisition of things will determine your status in this world, and you need to have more than you ever has. And that sort of motivation for what we do in life and what motivates us to go forward in life was a really corrosive concept. And I think we are still grappling with that, but we are also grappling with the downside of that. So what happens when the market cannot answer all your needs? The market is not meant to answer people's needs, certainly not their most fundamental needs, right? So I think as a society, we have gotten away from shared values. And, some ask, what were those shared values? And where is the public space to talk about those shared values? And so, I not to get too overtly political about this, but I think President Obama used to talk to us about that a lot as a nation, right? Particularly in response to moments of national tragedy, particularly around gun violence. And he would challenge us about, what our fundamental beliefs were as Americans and what we were required to do to support and lift each other up. And I think without a voice or voices in our national consciousness to challenge us about that, I think it's too easy for people to get wrapped up in their individual households, right? So now everybody is doing extreme navel gazing, right? I'm only responsible for, and I'm only concerned about what's happening in my space. And when too many of us think that way, not enough of us are working on how to build an economy and a society where people can thrive. All people can thrive. And we're so far away from that right now. And I think that's why people feel so disjointed. They feel so unmoored. And there's no national political leadership to speak to where we are, right? This strange moment that we find ourselves in. In fact, our national political leadership is doing exactly the opposite, as opposed to creating and supporting a national consciousness, if you will, about, what it means to be an American, what we value, the whole notion of demonizing immigrants. I just find it so extraordinary because every white person in America is an immigrant, every single one. And how people don't know that, it's like they don't know what happened before they got here. And so when President Obama was first served in his first term, and there was this big rallying cry about, I want my country back, I would say, and Ireland and England and Poland and, all the other parts of Europe desperately need your ass to come back because their population is down to the roof. They need you back. That's what I would say. I'd say, so have you had some conversations with the nations? Because they certainly were here. This was their country. And we've done everything in our power to try and wipe them off the face of the earth. So all the rest of us are immigrants. Now, I don't know. African Americans, we're not sure if we are actually immigrants because we came here in bondage and not voluntarily, for the most part, right? So we're still unclear about our relationship to that word immigrant. But every damn body else is an immigrant. How can you demonize immigrants? I just don't understand it. I don't understand it. We're a country that was founded on immigration. Right? George Washington was born in England. So, as you see, I could go on and on and on about this.
Well, you're certainly not wrong. And it's it interests me kind of as we see that on this national level that these values seem to be really hard to come by and that conversation about them seems to be even harder to come by. Do you think that there's hope perhaps at local levels that there are individual communities that are better addressing some of these issues than we are at a national level?
I'm sorry, ask me that again.
So are we is there more hope at a local level to kind of address some of these issues than at a national level? Are we seeing the kind of that conversation thrives when people can see and know each other better before they get into it? Or where do you find hope these days?
Where do I find hope? Well, communities are in a sense are like children. And what I mean by that is that no matter what you throw at a child, children are so incredibly, right? Especially poor kids who have been through a lot. But still they rise, right? But still they go on. And communities are like that, even the most economically depressed places in our country, people are still going about their everyday, objectives. They're still, pushing that boulder up the hill. And, you do what you have to do. I have to say, though, I'm a little taken aback, or more than a little taken aback, about the opiate epidemic, and that a lot of people are throwing in the towel. And I guess just, the way I was raised, you never give up, and you never give in, right? You may have to stop for a minute and regroup. Maybe the path that you were on turns out not to be the right path. You stop, you evaluate, you look at your options, or you come up with a new plan, but you always keep going, and you never, ever, ever, ever throw in the towel. At least that's the way I was raised, right? Never throw in the towel, never give up, never. Because if you work hard for something, the joy that you will be able to experience when you get to that place, right? My dad used to talk to me all the time about, oh my goodness, what did he call it? Oh my goodness, I can't believe I can't remember the term, but the notion is that you sacrifice and you plan for the long term, right? Delayed gratification. And we used to have conversations about this when I was a child, that you make investments at the front end so that you can benefit from those investments later on in life. But there's some things you have to do, right? And as far as he was concerned, getting an education was paramount, because if you didn't have a good education, it didn't matter whatever else you did. But if you had a good education, you could achieve virtually anything, was what my dad believed. And he planted that in my head, and I believe that, right? And I try to tell that to folks all the time, and I speak at lots of colleges and universities to try to inspire young people to not be daunted by the current political climate, by the debt load that they are going to have to absorb in order to get through college and get through graduate school, but that there is something good and positive and nurturing and enduring waiting for them. And it's not pie in the sky, but you got to work for it. And so, that's what keeps me going. That I know that my dad was right. My mother would say, but as you're moving through life, make sure you treat people with dignity and you honor every person, no matter their station in life. So when I was growing up in Harlem in the 60s, we were having an opiate epidemic, a heroin epidemic. Unfortunately, it didn't garner any national attention, and it was happening in Black communities all over the United States. Another conversation for another podcast. But so we would invariably, as she was walking to work in the morning, and she would drop me off at my babysitter, and then I would go to school. And this was all going on in a 5-block radius. Where we lived, where my babysitter was, where my school was, where our church was, where the hospital, where my mother and father worked. This all was in a 5-block radius. And invariably, we would encounter some, as we called them, some junkie who was strung out on heroin, rolling in the street or, on a stoop or, just literally on the street. And that person, when they would see my mother, they would straighten themselves up and they would say, "Hey, Miss Lyles, how are you?" And my mother would speak and we would keep going. And she would tell me all the time, I went to school with that person. But you never know how far people have fallen. But don't you ever think that you are so special that you can't speak to every person that you encounter. That's my mother said that to me all the time. And I think between, my father's sense of never giving up and my mother's sense of valuing everybody and treating everybody with kindness and fairness and equity, and making sure that those who don't have, that if you have something and other people need, that it's your moral obligation to make sure that their needs are met, right? Those are the values that I was raised in. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of things, right? But we had values, and those values have motivated me and kept me going throughout my life. And neither of my parents are still alive, to be able to see what I've done with the lessons that they planted deep in my head. But I try to work every day, Brad, every day, to try to make somebody else's life better, or to try to take that which is causing people pain and discomfort, to take it away, right? Or to give people the tools to be able to address the environmental challenges or the public health challenges that they are experiencing. Give people the tools so that they can have the power to control their own destiny. That I work at that level in a lot of spaces, and sometimes it's around a lot of complex environmental issues and environmental policy. But I help the most local communities understand and master that information, no matter how complex it might be, so that they can be part of the decision making that controls their own lives, right? And I'm just doing for other people what was done for me.
But what a powerful story there, and I think it's one of the crucial things that we look at now is that you mentioned earlier that how many people are focused on, I think as you put it, looking at their own navel and trying to figure out what can I do to get ahead. And so my wife will occasionally drag me to the mall here in Roanoke, and I almost always wind up depressed because I'm like, I've been around town for a little while. I've been involved in a lot of things. I almost never see anyone I know at the mall. And so every time I walk out, I think, what if we could have activated 100 of those folks, 100 of those, 1,500 or 2,000 folks that are in the mall now? What if we could get them to do these things that you're talking about doing something, focusing their life on making life easier for other people? How do you go about activating people like that and creating them? Is it, you mentioned education, is that kind of the foundation for all of that, or where do you go?
I think education is a big part of it, but I also think that one thing that we are really struggling with today is what it means to be a part of a community, right? So I look at it, for example, it's always very interesting to me. So, being a social scientist, every situation I'm in, is data collection, right? The total nerd that I am. And so there's a lot of data collection that I just do on a daily basis about where I physically live in Maryland. So I live in this wonderful subdivision. We have a pool, we have tennis courts, we have our own parks, all in this community of 550 homes, right? 550 families. And on any given day, there's hardly anybody ever in the parks. I never see anybody playing tennis. I hardly ever see anybody using the pool. Hell, my husband and I have lived here for 20 years. We've never been in no, my husband's been in the pool a couple of times. I've never been in the pool. The point that I'm making is that there are 550 families that live here, right, who share a lot in common in terms of our background, our class, our race, our ethnicity, our goals in life to do well for our families and take care of our families. It's a very civically minded community. When there's an election, the thing I love the most about where I live is that when there's an election, it's like they're giving away free money. Everybody and their mama votes when there's an election. Local elections, state elections, and certainly federal elections. People, it's like a religious fervor here. There's an election, oh my God, I got to go vote, right? I love that because that's the only time you see everybody in the community is when there's an election. But other than that, you hardly see anybody. People don't go out of their homes for the most part. You don't see people walking around a lot. You'll see a few people walking in the evenings, but you'll see a few people walking their dogs. But for all the people who live here, you would think the streets would be teeming with people talking to each other and socializing, or that people would be at the clubhouse where the pool is and, gathering and socializing. Nobody does that here. Nobody. It's the weirdest freaking thing I've ever seen. And I notice it's true of all the subdivisions where I live, and it's nothing but subdivisions where I live, right? Really affluent people, doing well, right? But no community. And so, the piece of data that I have taken from this experience is that, while the housing stock where I grew up at in Harlem was not the best, there was a lot of adequacy. There was a lot of needs not being met. There weren't a lot of supermarkets or pharmacies or, the things that make for a thriving community, so they tell me. But the one thing we did have, we had community. We had people who knew each other's families. Like there were people who knew my mother and grandmother, right? People who went, the church that I grew up in as a child is the church that my mother went to and that my grandmother went to. And the people that went to school with my mother, generations later, they knew me and they would see me on the street and they would know that I was Miss Lawson's daughter. And there was nothing. I tell you, Brad, my favorite holiday growing up in New York, not Christmas, not Easter, though I love Easter, it was Halloween. Because I grew up in a building that was 17 stories high with apartments A through S on every floor. Ooh. And I'm telling you, Halloween in a tall building is like Christmas that never ends. I would have to come home 4 and 5 times a night on Halloween, dropping off candy, shopping bags full of stuff. My dad would make me take it to school and give away to my classmates. He said, there's no way in hell I'm going to let you eat all that candy. But it was just, that's what you did, right? Because we were a community. We knew everybody. So everybody had to have candy because their own kids were out there, trick-or-treating. So they knew that, well, I want people to be good to my kids, so I'm going to be good to other people's kids. People would be apoplectic if somehow they had forgotten it was Halloween and they didn't have candy. People would bake cookies so they would have something to give to the kids. Community. I grew up in a community of people. I still know those people. They still know me. And they will know me as long as I'm on the face of this earth. Those people who I grew up with will know me. They will, when I'm back home in New York, they see me on the street, I have to stop and talk. I don't care where I'm going or what I'm trying to do. If I see somebody that I grew up with and I don't stop and talk, oh my God, I'll never hear the end of it. They'll talk about me like a dog. Who does she think she is? She's still Vernice from Delaware Village, But that sense of community, and I guess I'm really blessed and highly favored for having grown up in a place where there were thousands of people, but those thousands of people were connected to each other, either through our churches or the schools that we went to, or both of my parents worked at Harlem Hospital. Harlem Hospital was a universe. It was like a country unto itself, right? Everybody who worked it was the largest employer in the community, and everybody who worked at the hospital had a lifetime association with each other. You watched each other's children grow up. You watched, you went to people's family's funeral as their family members got old and passed away. You were there, a part of each other's lives. That is not true where I live. So I live on a cul-de-sac. Yes, I know I'm a bad environmentalist who lives on a street that you can't drive through, right? But there's 6 houses on my street, Brad. And except for one house directly across the street, the circle from me, all the rest of us have lived here together on this street for 20 years or more. I know my 2 neighbors. My husband and I know 2 of our neighbors, but the other 3 houses, we have no idea who those people are. We don't know what their names are. We don't know what their last name is. If we were standing next to them, we couldn't actually tell you what they look like. And to me, this is just such a foreign concept. This is not a community. It's a subdivision. And there's a profound difference between a community and a subdivision. And I've learned that from living here. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm really comfortable, and I got deer. I don't put any chemicals on my grass, my husband and I. He hates that, but there's no chemicals on my grass. So the deer have formed a community, and the deer come and they congregate in our property all the time because they know the grass is sweet. And nobody is going to chase them away or threaten them. Yesterday afternoon, I was pulling the shades down in the basement, and there were 2 fawns right next to the window. I mean, not far off in the backyard, but right next to the window eating. I think there's wild mint out there, and they were eating that. And they looked up and they saw me, and they didn't move, and then they went back to eating, right? And I got the most extraordinary birds, and it gets dark at night. You're from Roanoke, so you know what I'm talking about, right? That there's a peacefulness about this place that I could not achieve in New York. But what I gave up to get this peacefulness is I gave up my community. And I gave up being a part of a community. And that's pretty profound. Fortunately, I lived there for 40 years, right? So you can never take that from me. It's always going to be a part of me, having grown up in the Harlem community, right? I went to college and graduate school in Harlem at Columbia University. I was born in Harlem Hospital. Everything about Harlem flows through me. So that helps to define me and to shape my worldview. But people who are growing up here where I live, they have a lot of creature comforts, but what they don't have is they don't have community. And I think without having that, it really might stunt your development to a certain degree, because people then grow up and think that all I'm responsible for and all I have to worry about is what happens in my own household. Right? And even if you ask me, there's some young folks growing up who are all really not all that concerned about even what's happening in their own household.
Mm.
And I think that's very troubling for us as a society. And it to me, it goes back to that notion of that greed is good, right? I got to get mine, right? And the young folks even say that, right? I just got to get mine. That's what motivates me. I got to get mine. What do you got to get? That doesn't include other people, right? That doesn't include human relationships. That doesn't include a quality of being on this earth and knowing that you care for and look out for somebody else, and somebody cares for and looks out for you. And I guess it really is a function of having grown up where I grew up, in a place where people didn't have a lot of things, but they took great care in the place that they lived and the quality of the relationships that they had with each other. And, so I live in this strange place, and, so consequently, and much to my husband's chagrin, people are always at our house, right? It's either family are visiting or friends are visiting, or my friends who are here in the DMV and DC, Maryland, Virginia area with me. They're always over at our house because I have to have this community, right? And since I don't naturally have it, I'm always trying to create it. So I think that we have lost that. And I think that, again, so how I look at communities is probably different than a lot of other people because I grew up in a thriving environment, not economically thriving, not environmentally thriving, but in terms of human relationships. I would say that we were one of the most extraordinary communities in the entire United States of America. And that people who grew up in Harlem in the 60s, like I did, we are forever bound to each other, right? And so you're reading the paper. I still have to read my hometown paper, the New York Times, and you read the paper and you hear about, this person has done that, or you see an article written about this person or that person, somebody that you knew, and the sense of pride that you are flooded with, just to see that, folks are still doing good things. Are still looking out and caring for each other. And that just is fundamentally a part of who I am. But I recognize that I'm in the minority and that we're in a society where we are replicating these values about greed and attainment of wealth and status. And, sort of, I got to get paid. And, I think that if that's your focus, that you lose so much of the value of what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a well-rounded person. And I think we really got to course correct because we're giving our young people a message that is not affirming about who they are, about how they invest their time, about what they strive for in life. We are not giving out messages of affirmation. And I think that also has a lot to do with the opiate epidemic that, people are struggling. But hell, people are not struggling anymore in 2017 than they were when I was growing up in Harlem in 1965. And it's like orders of magnitude different, But somehow people are throwing in the towel and saying, look, I'm just going to do whatever I can do to anesthetize myself. And that just was never acceptable. When I was growing up, it just was never acceptable. Just throwing in the towel was never acceptable. And so it may sound like I'm not compassionate or I'm dispassionate. It's not that I am not dispassionate about this, but I know that we have been through more difficult times as a society than we are going through now. And it was our resilience. It was our perseverance. It was our connectedness to each other that helped us to get through the difficult times. And if we don't get that spirit back, we're going to experience things that are a lot more devastating than an opiate epidemic.
What a just incredibly powerful description of the importance of community and what happens when it falls apart. I could sit here all day with you, Vernice, but I suppose we should probably try and bring it to a close here. And I wonder if you could kind of.
I guess.
I wish not, but I think our listeners might want to move on with their day. But I wonder if you could share a story about what a community looks like when it works well, or what a community should look like.
So, I'm going to try to give an example while I'm talking to you. I'm going to see if I can find this story. I think I can. So, I know these two women. One's name is Anita Maltbia, and the other's name is Margaret. Oh my God, how can I not remember her last name? Oh, she's gonna kill me. Miss May, Margaret May. And they are both from Kansas City, Kansas. And they have been working on a project called the Green Impact Zone for a long time. Miss May leads an organization called Ivanhoe Neighborhood Thrive. And I hope I can find it here on Twitter. Somebody posted an article about what happens when, a community has a vision for itself and it begins to live out that vision. And it's about the revitalization of this part of Kansas City. And, there are people who are taking the reins by the horn and saying that, so, the federal government is not coming to save us. The cavalry is not coming. Philanthropy may not even know that we exist. But we have to dig deep, and we have to find the resources, find the human capital to do what needs to be done to restore our communities and restore our people as a result. And some communities are really doing that. And, they're all over the country in a variety of different places where people are coming together to plan for the revitalization and the future of their communities. And I'm just really, I'm really lifted up by those places. I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, earlier this year. I think it was March. And the city of Greensboro and community leaders in Greensboro are planning a massive campaign for fair housing. Even though the federal government is stepping away from a push for fair housing. Here we go. This Kansas City neighborhood wrote the blueprint for transforming a community. It's an article on Grist. You can find it at grist.org/justice. It's just so anyway, I was in Greensboro, and even though the federal government is stepping back from being the arbiter and the main advocate for fair housing policy and enforcement in our country, they've decided in Greensboro, North Carolina, that in order for Greensboro to become the city that it was always meant to be, that a push for fair housing has got to be what they focus their energy and their resources on, right? There are all kinds of communities all over the country that are taking the reins by the horns and planning for themselves, planning for the future of their communities, and they need to get, they need to get lifted up, and they need to get the national attention that they deserve for the great work that they're doing, oftentimes without a lot of resources, but they're doing it. There's an effort going on. There's a municipal effort going on to drive community revitalization based on racial justice, right? There's the Government Alliance for Racial Equity through DARE, a project of the Center for Social Inclusion. People are just, are stepping up and doing some of the complex things that are required to make their communities livable and just and equitable so that people could thrive. And some people are recognizing that you can't create the kind of community that you want to live in if everyone does not have a place and if everyone's needs are not met, right? If there's a lot of people who are homeless and then just a few people who are living really, really well, that's not going to hold for very long, right? And so there are a lot of people who've come to that recognition. I'm not sure. I guess this sort of political moment that we're in is making people recognize that The cavalry is not coming at the federal level, right? We had this moment, we had 8 years with Barack Obama where he challenged us all to think about what it means to be an American, what it means to be part of a community, and what it means to look out for those who do not have what we have or who do not have anything, right? He challenged us as our national leader to think about that. But we're not going to have that for a while. So we got to challenge each other. And I think we have the capacity to do it, but we got to get serious about it. Climate change is coming, right? Sea level rise is coming. No matter what people say, it's coming. And you can't survive at the household level. You have to survive at the community and the neighborhood level. You have to thrive at the societal level. It can't all be happening inside your four walls. You got to step outside, and you got to link up with other people. So that's what gives me hope. I hope it can inspire other folk, but you just cannot take on the challenges of the world by yourself. You need partners, you need collaborators, you need a community.
Well, I'm into all of that, and thank you so much for taking the time today, Vernice. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to hopefully amplify your voice to a few new people who have not heard it before. For those of you all that are interested, Vernice spoke at CityWorks Expo last year. You can see her talk on cityworksexpo.com. But thank you so much for taking the time today, and I hope we get a chance to reconnect again soon, Vernice.
Me too. I hope you invite me back to CityWorks.
Oh, you are welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.